Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott, in Oxford in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to this, the 61st jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand you over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button and not the chat one. These will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them to the panel to consider. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you, so that there is not a bottleneck at the end, or we find out that we run out of time. Now, over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mike, and good to be doing this again. This is next to the last in this series, and we are very pleased to have some returnees on the cast today. First, David Jones, who's a former Conservative Member of Parliament in the UK, and has had a number of very significant positions in the European stage as well as the UK stage. He was vice chair of the European Research Group, an influential force within the British Conservative Party. Nancy Wei, Xinjuan Nancy Wei, who is coming to us today from Wenzhou, China, where she teaches at Wenzhou Kean University. It's the Chinese partner of the Kean University in New Jersey in the United States. She taught for many years at the University of Bridgeport in the US, and has focused quite a bit in her research and her work on US-China relations. Howard Robinson is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall at Oxford and has taught philosophy at Oriel College. He was a particular player and at one point the provost of the Central European University, which has now moved to Vienna, as I understand it. And Daniel Nexon is a professor at Georgetown University with a joint appointment in the government department of the School of Foreign Service. He focuses on international relations theory, power politics, and international order. My intelligence is that he's a very favored lecturer in survey courses for students just arriving as undergraduates at Georgetown. He introduces them to the world. We will begin, I think, with this. It's a very interesting question I think we have on our plate today. Who are the next world powers? Who are the people that we will, the countries that we will think about as accumulating followers and allies and sympathizers along the way? Or is there going to be a multipolar world, a totally changed world, where individual countries' sovereignty is the real issue at stake for them, not who their best friends are? So I think I'd like to go first to Howard Robinson about that from his pan-European perspective over the years. Who are the next people we have to think about, maybe even worry about, Howard?
Well, obviously China, but I'm puzzled by you thinking that sovereignty and serious alliances are inconsistent with each other.
Well, that's not the implication I mean to make, but what is the priority for countries, I guess I'm asking.
Right. But nobody lost their sovereignty through NATO, say.
No,
So there are
true.
things where people try and develop into, as it were, a super state or something like it. There are others where they have firm alliances. And somebody who thinks you can go it entirely on your own without any friends is not the same as somebody who thinks your sovereignty is sovereign.
Right.
But apart from that, China, obviously, what will happen to America under this wayward leadership, goodness knows. They intend to withdraw and yet become stronger, which seems a difficult mixture. India, I think, is such a naturally diverse country. It wasn't a state or a political entity until the British made it a political entity. The subcontinent is a natural geographical entity, but the state, I believe in the late 50s, early 60s, the Indians tried to abolish English as one of their national languages because it's an imperialist language, and they found that they couldn't hold a conference in anything but English because it was the only language they all had in common. So I don't see India being able to be coherent enough or cohesive enough to be a leader of a bloc so it'll have sympathizers and connections, but not that. So, and Europe, well, so the Chinese are obviously the great threat, but I don't know that I have anything more to say than that. Sorry if it's not very helpful.
No, that it is helpful. Nancy Wei, what do you here you are speaking from China, and we don't often get, I think in some Western countries, we don't often take the time to look for authentic Chinese voices to give us their opinions. And we know you from prior participation, and so we think you might do that.
And thank you for having me. It is such a great pleasure to join you and other distinguished scholars and politicians. For me, I see that certainly China is a rising power. Just less than 2 weeks ago, President Trump mentioned China and the US relationship in a new phrase, which made many wonder what he meant. So he used the term G2. And then that has been interpreted as the sitting US president for the first time acknowledging China for having equal status. And days after that, the Secretary of War, Hexas, also mentioned this G2 term. So that got a lot of people wondering what's the new relationship. Is that going to be typically rivalry, or it's typically going to be cooperative or competitive? So anyhow, my point is that I certainly see China as a rising power. It's, if our term is who's the next great power, I would say China will have a place. And for another one, I would say Russia would be another great power, and India as possibly the fourth one, in addition to the United States. So that's where I see this. Out of the four, I see China is becoming, almost like a peer competitor or a peer great power. Russia, mainly its power is located in its size of the territory, its military, and its oil and energy resources. For India, it's the population makes India certainly gives its potential, but India is still so far in the potential area. That's where I see the rank after the United States.
Okay, Dan Nexon, how do you respond to that?
My answer is I don't know. If you were to go back 20 years ago, we would certainly anticipate the continued rise of China because of the trend lines over the prior 10, 15 years. But if you, said to, but remember that, 20 years ago, the United States bestrode the world like a colossus. People were talking about the Pax Americana. I don't think many people are talking about that now. And so the point is that it's a very long time. In a few decades, should we assume, for example, that countries like Nigeria in 15 or 20 years will look the same way and not be able to capitalize on a large population and resources? What should we think, will happen with Brazil or other countries? And so my first comment is that, if you look around the world right now, clearly China and the United States are the biggest powers on the block in terms of having a combination of military, diplomatic, and economic capability. But the European Union feels a little sclerotic right now, but it's been through phases where it's felt more sclerotic, and it's been through phases where it's felt like a very powerful entity. So I don't know. And I think we have to be careful about assuming straight line projections from the current state of affairs. The second comment I would just make is that our standards for what constitute a great power are a little skewed by the post-war environment, which is to say that we tend to think about great powers as being countries like the United States or the Soviet Union in the 60s or 70s that had global power projection capability. And we don't remember that prior to the end of World War II, the great powers, was a much bigger potential club that included first-tier great powers and second-tier great powers. And so a lot of countries that we might not think of as great powers because they can't necessarily employ force anywhere in the world, but that probably do qualify as great powers on a regional basis. And so we need to be kind of sensitive to those kinds of issues, like what do we actually mean by great power?
Right. Well, that's a good question. What is the latitude that great powers exercise over others? David Jones, you retired relatively recently from your career in Parliament and a great deal of influence over British foreign relations. How do you see things evolving, especially in the period since you left Parliament?
Well, can I say that I agree with the other panelists to the extent that in terms of prognosticating what is going to happen, I really don't know.
Of course.
What I can say, however, is that in terms of the global projection of power, it's likely to be the United States as now, certainly China, which is arming militarily very quickly. India, I think, unlike Howard, I think that India is going to be a great global power. I take his point about the fact that it's a very diverse country, but it is the largest country in terms of population in the world now. And it is already making alliances. It's a member of the Quad. It's a member of BRICS. It is actually expanding its power. It's also nuclear armed. Russia, I feel, is on the cusp of whether or not it's to be a great power. I think that what's happening in Ukraine has come as an almighty shock to Vladimir Putin. And it's quite clear that other countries, Western countries, are now continuing to arm Ukraine, and Russia may suffer a severe bloody nose, which could actually destroy its prospects of remaining as a great global power. I think the other point that Daniel made is an extremely important one. There are other powers in the world which may not be able to project power globally, but in terms of their own regions are very significant players. Israel is an obvious example. What is done over the last few months has been really quite extraordinary. We've got Saudi Arabia, which has a very large armed force, is continuing to develop its own capability. And in the Indo-Pacific, we've got Australia, which is now a member of AUKUS with the UK and the US, is also a member of the Quad and is extending its reach there. So there are a large number of countries that I think will have significant influence in important parts of the world. And Daniel mentioned Nigeria. Nigeria's got a vast population. I think that if the infrastructure in Nigeria were to be improved, then we could see that as a major regional player too. But it's very hard to prognosticate, Sandy.
Right. I read something only this morning that said that Nigeria is taking a significant role in the alternative energy markets and developing solar and wind power, which is not something that would have naturally occurred to us, I think, that Nigeria would have the luxury of doing such a thing. I do think with regard to Russia, one reads quite a lot now about their population problem, not a big population problem, but the opposite of India, shrinking population, and what it's going to do to maintain its ambitions in that case. I wonder if anyone wants to take that point and talk about the dilemma for Russia of continued military mischief, I think we could call it, at the same time as having potentially a shrinking economy.
I think that's a very major problem, if I may say so, for Russia. The Russian economy is in a very parlous position at the moment. You make the point about the population growth and the reverse. I think that that's a problem for the Western world as a whole.
Sure.
Certainly is for the UK and probably for the US too. And it may even be for China as well, because of course in China we had the one-child rule for a long time. I think the issue of depopulation is one that's going to have to be faced by a lot of countries throughout the world, and not just Russia.
Yeah,
Anyone else on that point, Dan?
I mean, the so-called demographic cliff, or the graying of the populations in the advanced industrialized countries, and here I do include China, has been a well-known issue for quite some time. The interesting thing from my perspective as somebody whose focus is probably more than anything else now on American foreign policy is that if you ask people 10 years ago what one of the big advantages the United States supposedly had over the European powers or over China or over Japan, it was precisely that the United States had an above replacement birth rate. But that was that's been hit by two things now. One is COVID seems to have driven down birth rates in a lot of places in the developed world. And secondly, that was mostly being driven by first generation immigrants, right? So it was immigration that was sustaining the US birth rate, which we seem to have made a decision to, shall we say, move away from as a basis of continued US population growth. And so it now looks like that's just a problem that every country that's gone through the so-called demographic transition, that is where the number of children, people are having fewer children, in part because they don't need them to work farms, and in part because they don't expect them to die before they reach the age of 10. Every country that's been through that, which is a process that takes decades, is facing the same challenges. And the big question is whether, as countries in the so-called global South develop, whether they will also undergo the same kind of demographic transition that we've seen in the so-called global North.
Nancy, what about this issue of population in China? Is it going from one extreme to another over time? Does China find itself in a bind for manpower, person power to fuel its economic growth?
This is a great question about the population issue. Indeed, many people are wondering about the situations here. So people who were born like, in the US, we call it like the baby boomers era. In China also experienced the baby boomer era in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But then the one-child policy hit, which was a result of a think tank based in Italy. It was called the Club of Rome its report in 1970s led to Chinese leaders to adopt this policy called the one-child policy. And it was, I mean, nowadays scholars see that as, some say, oh, well, it did its job. Over 300 million people were not born. On the other hand, it also caused a significant problem. Some people thought it was a total failure, while others, do see there's some merit. Overall, I think a lot of people regret the one-child policy. That's my view. As to how to mediate the damage, and I think China has a solution. The solution is to have lots of robots to do the job. And then China now have the dark factory. So it's basically factory which is run 24 hours and without people working, it's all machinery. And that may be the solution for China to maintain its productivity.
Nancy, while we have your attention, do you think that other countries in the region, including some countries that have very proud past or symbolic significance, Thailand, Vietnam, others that haven't always gotten along well with China, are they worried, do you suppose, about China's increasing stature?
China's rapid rise in the region and also in the international stage certainly would have made a lot of countries worried. However, China adopted a policy which is assurance. At the same time, when it was rising, it assured the region that it would not do certain things. For example, in the South China Sea, the assurance is that will not take the newest, any unoccupied islands. China will not take over those. So there are, I would say, the worry is there, but it's not that prominent because of the assurance. China's assured the region that it would not do certain things. So that assurance was also important to allay the fear in the region. I do not think China has any territorial disputes with Thailand. Slightly, a little bit of the thing is in the South China Sea with Indonesia. But the majority of the fear is between China and India, because the country has thousands long of a border. And then in 2020, the two had, got to kind of scuffles along the border. So some people, like around 2,000 people died. So anyhow, that's the main, it's between China and India. With the other two countries, like Indonesia is way less because China just built the longest, the fastest, what's the word? The rail, high-speed rail for Indonesia, which is called the Whoosh. It's really a major project. And then with the Thailand, the two countries generally have good relations.
Howard, how about rivalries in Europe? Have they, for the most part, gone away? And will Europe be able to build itself up as a single force in this global scramble?
Well, Hungary is not a very good unified country with the rest of them. I mean, it's difficult to believe, given 1956 and all that you have a Hungarian government that sucks up to a Russian government in the way that Orbán does to Putin. So Hungary's barely participant in many ways, apart from having a lot of German factories in the country. And then you've got some of the other countries, Slovakia, is it, that elect people who are quite similar to that. So I think Europe, because of its economic difficulties, in so much as that's the case, is not in a very coherent way. It seems on the whole, apart from those one or two countries, to be fairly clear in its defense of Ukraine. But no, the European Union is in a tentative state at the moment, I would have thought. I mean,
do you think Britain, overall, the population of Britain is pleased to have left the European Union, or?
I don't want to open the question again, but most of them seem to say when asked that it was a mistake at the current opinion polls, as far as I can see.
You're tempting
certainly
me.
they would like to be closer relations. That's to say more Norwegian, if you like, in so much as ordinary people have an opinion on that kind of thing, which they don't and shouldn't, therefore shouldn't be asked. But the I think they want to find the economic side of things working more closely, probably. Certainly when it affects them adversely, which it seems to with small businesses, as far as one can see.
David, I'm sorry, please go ahead, Howard. I didn't mean to.
Oh, no, that's
David, you cut in there for a moment and I wanted to.
Yeah, I made a facetious remark that I might take issue with, Howard, but I won't, because it's a different issue. But what I would like to mention is the point that Nancy made about robots in China. Of course, the growth of artificial intelligence probably means that we don't need as many people as we thought we did. And that sort of raises another issue. These corporations are incredibly powerful. You've got the likes of NVIDIA, which is probably worth much more than many small states throughout the world. The power that these corporations have and exert, or could exert, possibly makes them a world power too, either collectively or individually. And I think that that's another interesting subject, possibly, of conversation. How are these great corporations going to be regulated?
You know, when you just mentioned
they're mobile, they can move. They can adopt whichever jurisdiction they want in the world, because of course the cyberspace has no geographical boundaries.
Right. When you just mentioned robots, a very whimsical thought occurred to me that the population of countries might be restated with how many people there are and how many robots there are. That doesn't mean the robots are all equally adept at what they've been assigned to do. But maybe we need to know that. Maybe we need to know which economies, which societies, which cultures are more into high-tech solutions and alternative ways of dealing with some of the things, in order to sharpen and refine our analysis of such matters. Dan, has that occurred to you?
Well, I want to come back to this issue of multinational corporations and corporate power, which I obviously, I will make no secret about my political leanings, which are left progressive, and I think that a lot of the United States' structural problems are related to the financialization of the economy and the growth in power of sort of the Magnificent Seven, the big corporations that have huge valuations. Not all of them can deliver on those valuations in terms of profit or income streams. But I will say that we've been having this debate in my field since long before I was in it about the rise of MNCs and the retreat of the state. This was something that was being debated in the 70s, for example.
MNCs being multinational
corporations. And I think a very eminent, much missed British political economist named Susan Strange wrote some of the best work on the subject. And Strange's main point, which I think is still true, is that these corporations have the power they have so long as states allow them to have the power that they have. That is, they can wield their resources in a number of settings to influence politics, to influence regulatory agencies. But at the end of the day, if the United States government decided to strip, Tesla, or I'm sorry, Musk's empire, for example, of its contracts and to regulate and reassign his wealth, it would be very easy to do. In the same way that NVIDIA has an enormous amount of money on paper. I think that's all being driven by a tech boom. And we're going to see that bubble collapse. But even if it does, these very rich corporations again kind of exist ultimately at the sufferance of states. States remain extremely powerful. Cyberspace is another good example of this. I was talking about this with one of my students in my state formation class yesterday. There's no reason. So first of all, cyberspace, we often think of it as having no borders because that's our experience of it. But in fact, it depends on an enormous physical infrastructure, much of which is national. So, I live in DC, where the backbone of the modern internet has been for a long time. In Northern Virginia, it's there because it's built on ARPANET, which was a federal project. And you got sort of what are called network effects, preferential attachment. Corporations moved in and built it out. That means that that has been a source of U.S. power in many respects, but it also is again gets to the fact that the physical infrastructure matters. You can turn off pipelines through Egypt, for example, and disrupt internet e-commerce. And there's no reason why the internet has to look the way that did. The internet technologies emerged during a period of U.S.-led neoliberal globalization. It was not terribly regulated. It wasn't even built for, with the applications that exist now in mind. But if the same technologies had been developed in the 70s or 80s, we would have seen programs more like France's, right? France had an alternative model, which was a national model. You could go to the French telecoms and buy a station and do email-like things in the 80s and 90s. You could have seen that develop. And indeed, the trend right now is toward the nationalization of the internet. A lot of countries look at what China did with the Great Firewall and they say they want that. Russia certainly would have loved to have had that in the 2000s and had to innovate ways of compensating for not being able to cut off internet communications. And the most recent conferences negotiations, which Russia and China dominated, allowed for greater nationalization. So I think that we make a mistake in assuming that the apparent borderless world of cyberspace is actually that way, and that it will remain that way if sovereign states or states decide that they want to more greatly regulate it. I mean, just to add, in the US context, those of us who are concerned about rising authoritarianism, oligarchy, whatever you want to call it, look a lot at Russia and think about how a president who moves further in the direction that Trump has done could very easily destroy the tech companies that don't fall in line with the policies that he prefers. In fact, he could do that now. And so I think we can just sort of confuse a policy choice for an objective state of the world sometimes.
Thank you. I wonder, you mentioned the word sovereignty, and I wonder to what extent some countries are worried about their sovereignty in this domain, and whether they should be under the current competition for influence. I don't know if you want to take that up, Daniel.
I mean, I don't want to stop an hour of people, but this is the paradox of a quote unquote multipolar world, right? We've been living through, we lived through a period that in my field we call US hegemony, right? In the 90s and early 2000s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union as the US's only pure competitor, and the US made a decision to enlarge the order that it had built primarily in Western Europe, East Asia, and elsewhere. In fact, that was the name of the grand strategy initially of the Clinton administration, was enlargement, but it was an effort to push US preferences about, and also French and British preferences about political systems and about economic relations into areas, as far as it could across the globe. I mean, I think that we have to actually be careful about that story, because I think that we underestimate the degree to which that period was not so much the United States, but a cartel centered around the G7, in which there were certain tacit and explicit agreements to pursue very similar economic policies and to allow the United States to dominate in the security arena, which was a choice. If the Europeans had decided to rearm, they had the economic capacity to challenge the United States. They didn't, because it was advantageous to allow the United States to run security policy in many respects. But the key thing I want to say about that is that, so when you move into, so under those kinds of conditions, when you have essentially one cartel that is able to set the terms of things like development assistance or coerce states to engage in certain economic practices or incentivize them to otherwise, it feels like your sovereignty is being trodden on a lot, particularly because when one of those states occasionally engages in military interventions that nobody's strong enough to stop. So a multipolar world looks really attractive because you now have multiple potential patrons you can play off of each other, right? And that feels like it's sovereignty enhancing. That's the argument that's often made by populists. Alex Clwyd and I have a paper in which we call them multipolar populism, because they can kind of embrace, well, I don't have to kowtow to US demands on this, or Russian demands on this, or Chinese demands on this. I can just kind of get the best deal. The problem is that over the long haul, if you have competitive great powers, they tend to lose patience with states playing them off against one another. And the solution is often to impose hierarchical arrangements, to try to lock down their foreign policy autonomy as a way of keeping them from being able to play those games. The extreme form of this is the Soviet informal empire in Eastern Europe, but you also saw this in the US bloc, and this is, I think, kind of what we mean by blocism during the Cold War. So right now, if you think about your sovereignty, you probably feel pretty good about it because you have a lot more bargaining leverage with the great powers. But whether that lasts or not, that's an entirely different question.
Well, Nancy, that brings us back to you. With the Belt and Road Initiative and China's well-publicized success in reaching out to new countries in the sense they hadn't necessarily been connected with previously, is there a worry about a loss of sovereignty in some of those countries, do you think?
So far, the Belt and Road Initiative, it's already just celebrated its 10th year 2 years ago. So it started in 2013. Yeah, it's already about 10 years. So a lot of countries have signed up to it. Of course, in some cases, countries, like in the case of Sri Lanka, and countries felt kind of regretted it. And then when political leaders changed, and then they stopped. And then they renegotiated after a year, and then they went back to it. So that's the kind of situations. Countries who are strong enough would be able to defend their own sovereignties. And the countries who are having lots of problems, very weak countries, may not be able to do that. So it's actually difficult to generalize. There are cases which countries were able to take advantage of the system and develop better. And there are cases which countries are not doing very well. I mean, to a certain level, it's similar to the experiences many countries had with IMF. So because it's basically you are signing up to a loan, and then you get some countries are very successful, and like in the case of China in the 80s and 90s and borrowed money from IMF and the World Bank too. But these loans from IMF and World Bank actually greatly benefited China's development. On the other hand, countries like, let's see, Pakistan and Argentina, these are, failures. They borrow the money, and then these countries get even, worse and worse in the case. It's a similar story about the Belt and Road. It depends on internal institutions. If they are strong enough, you borrow money, and then you can, you're also having the discipline, and then at the end of the day, and then these projects benefited your country, and then you are getting better. On the other hand, if the country internally, the country is very weak and very corrupt systems, and then political changes back and forth, and then these situations would be not so good. So I would say there are different cases.
Right, case by case.
Yeah, it's a case by case.
In just a few minutes, we're going to go back to Mike Scott to take the questions of people attending the program remotely. So I might just mention this is a good time to put your questions into the Q&A button. There are some there now. I think about 3 of them, but if others have questions, please think about doing them. David Jones, when you've left a political career as you have in the UK, does it make you think about how Britain could have navigated things more adeptly in the last several decades so that it would be not dismissed from some of these conversations the way some people seem to do it?
Well, yes, I think that you all wonder what if, and certainly in my case, I thought very carefully for a long time about what would have happened to the UK if it had not joined the European Union in the first place. I spent a lot of time as a minister in the Department for Exiting the European Union thinking about that very thing. But ultimately, you can only take the world as it presents itself. Britain is now out of the European Union. It's got a role in the world. I think it's got a role in the world in terms, for example, of jurisdiction. The London Commercial Court is, by some considerable margin, the most important court in the world for resolving disputes. And the reason it is because, of course, it operates on the principle, on the system of common law, which is something that it shares with the United States, with other important countries right around the world. And I actually think that the common law is an important element of the current world order. It's probably the best way for disputes over issues such as technical contracts to be resolved. It operates on the basis of precedent rather than on the basis of civil law, which is prescriptive. And that, I think, is a role that Britain can take forward into the world in the future. I think that we've just talked about the Belt and Road Initiative. One of the issues about that, of course, is that the countries that adopt the initiative take their new technical and procedural norms from China. So the reality is that it is a new form of colonial power that is being exerted by China. Ultimately, I think that the countries and the other countries of this multipolar world, which is how you introduce this discussion, are going to have to think very carefully about whether they sign up to that too, or whether they would rather exercise the freedom of choice that they have. And when they enter into contracts with other countries, with other corporations, always ensure that it's the common law that is the basis of adjudication, because that will usually result in a conclusion that is preferable to all parties.
Can I generalize that point to cover what Daniel said as well about governments having the power over major corporations? It rather depends who owns the politicians, if the politicians are owned or not, as they seem to be in many ways in the United States. And if you, as you said, David, if the people in power depend a lot on the Chinese money and rules and are doing very well themselves out of it individually rather than country-wise, I mean, for example, most African countries don't seem to care very much, their governments, about the welfare of their people. They care about how much money they've got in the Swiss bank accounts. And that kind of thing is a great corrupter and deformer. And it can happen in some countries like the United States, where you feel a lot of politicians vote the way that the people who are paying for them want them to. And if they're being paid for by the tech giants, then it takes a lot. You've got to get them out and replaced by other people before you can do anything about it. I don't want to exaggerate that, but it's clearly a powerful factor.
Well, you could say that, yes. So let's go back to Mike Scott and ask him to tell us what the questions are from people outside the room, outside the virtual room, or maybe on the inside the virtual room, but that we don't see. Mike?
Hi, thank you. Thanks for a very interesting start to this discussion. One question that I think we perhaps might have gone to has come in. It says, how do we actually define a world power? What do we think about a world power?
Very good question.
Who wants to start on that? David Jones.
Well, yeah, I think traditionally great powers have been determined by their ability to project military power. But that's not necessarily the case these days. We've talked about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which of course is an exercise in the projection of Chinese influence across the world, but it is not necessarily a military power, although China is of course extremely well armed. I mentioned a few minutes ago the issue of the London Commercial Court. You could say that the United Kingdom is a great jurisdictional power in terms of the determination of disputes, many of them which may be jurisdictional. I think that the definition of a great power is something that is changing. And to get back to the discussion that we had some time ago and the very erudite contribution by Daniel, we still have the issue of these great corporations with the ability to locate themselves anywhere in the world. I take his point about the infrastructure, but you know, if a great American corporation decided, for example, that Iceland was a good place to set up shop, it would go there. So, you know, these are all new departures in the world. We're living in a very, very different world from what we were living in only 40 or 50 years ago.
So tradition, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on. Yes, please, Daniel.
I mean, traditionally in my field and in actually the way that governments have for a long time as well, they think about, when they try to measure the power of states, they think about capabilities, and they tend to aggregate various different kinds of indicators. So, you know, this could range from GDP per capita, military spending, number of troops. You know, back in the 19th century, around the time of the Concert of Vienna, the way that European states measured power was by counting the population, because they didn't have any other measures. So the number of souls you had was the proxy for how much powerful you supposedly were. These are very crude ways of talking about power, because power is not the same thing as capabilities. Capabilities are affordances that you might be able to use to wield power, but we don't necessarily know whether you can or will successfully use those capabilities to get what you want in the world. I think that as much as it might be frustrating, I think that great power is better seen as a club, as a status demarcation, right? Do other states recognize you as being a great power and afford you certain kinds of deferences and perquisites based on that recognition? That once we understand it that way, many of these capabilities are used as measures of whether or not you belong in that club. And they're used as proxies by states, weaker states, for whether or not they should pay deference to you. And that things you can do that are material in the real world, like bombing countries or cutting off their access to rare earth minerals, can certainly exercise leverage and contribute to the sense that you belong in that club. But ultimately, what we're talking about is a whole bunch of instruments, many of which are mostly valuable for symbolic purposes, for threats that or things that people think you might be able to wield them to do, and that membership in great powerness is very much a social position. And I think that's the only way we can make sense of what actually happens in the world. So,
thank you. Thank you. Nancy, do you want to just give a different perspective? Or?
Sure. Yeah, I like Dan. I also teach in this area. I teach international relations. So I do think power is a social construction, and then yeah, it's certainly related with status, and that's why countries pursue nuclear weapons, because it gives them a status, and it's like a club. The P5 countries, the permanent 5 countries, and they are all nuclear armed. And in addition to them, there are 4 additional countries. They also have nuclear weapons. So that's like a status. I agree that power is measured by its military, population, and economic size. And I would add another category to this, which is critical minerals. The reason the West was not able to beat Russia in the sanctions is because Russia has critical minerals and oil and energy resources. And these were like, during the wartime, it would be like the real currency. And that was why India and China needed those resources. So anyhow, another thing I would say, in the case of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, KSA has oil, the oil resources, but it also has controls certain because it's a size, it's a site of 2 critical religious sites, and this also gives the KSA certain power. So there are both softer and hard power. So that's my take on this.
Thanks. I think I can't leave this one without going to the philosopher, Howard.
I don't want to try and define it. That is the kind of areas where people trying to do that kind of thing doesn't get you anywhere. I mean, in a sort of the way that philosophers try to define things. One thing that did strike me, England or Britain did not used to have a large army before 1914, but it had a fantastic navy.
It had a huge, I have to interrupt, a huge army. The reason people do is they don't count the Indian army. If you count the Indian army, Britain had one of the largest armies in the world, which employed across Asia and in Africa. Who do you think did the bulk of the land fighting in the Opium Wars? And so we actually do this. We anachronistically go back and we think about England as the island when we think about its land army. England has actually had a very large army for a very long time during its period of global dominance.
Right, but for example, when we sent the army over in 1914, when the Kaiser said a contemptibly little army, not a contemptible little army, it was because we really, up to that point, did not have that kind of army we could deploy on the European continent, whereas, of course, the Germans and the French had spent the last 1,800 years fighting each other for territory. And they did have large armies of that sort, but we had an enormous navy. The Indian troops did come over and fight with us in the end, but I don't know what percentage of the final army, when we didn't have any, when people were conscripted, really made the difference in size, I think. Isn't that true? Perhaps I'm just being ignorant on this.
I'm going to stop on that one because I've got some more coming in from people listening. Marcus Tan says, how does Russia's great power, status, and military capabilities fare in 3 possible outcomes in the Ukraine? Victory defined as achieving Putin's minimum stated goals, long-term stalemate, and retreat back to pre-February 2022 invasion borders. So more of a David, do you want to have a go at this?
Well, I personally think that whatever the outcome of the conflict in Ukraine, it's going to be catastrophic for Russia because it's lost so much manpower, it's lost so much wealth. It's going to be severely, I think, hampered as a consequence of this war, whatever the outcome, for very many years to come. And ultimately, of course, it could even result in the downfall of Vladimir Putin. So I don't think that the outcome, the future is very rosy for Russia, whatever happens, whatever outcome we see.
Anybody else want to come in on that one? No? Okay, we go to another one that's being sent in from an anonymous attendee. How do you think the demographic change will affect China's position moving forward? What are they doing to address it? And do you anticipate it will be effective? Nancy, obviously, to you.
Oh, thank you. I earlier mentioned, yes, it's and I mean it's an acute issue. Local governments in China, different provincial governments are encouraging people to have more kids, but today's young people, have their own minds. On the other hand, I do see that the government and businesses put a lot of effort in China to use AI, like the robots, to increase the productivity, and that is actually very effective. Lots of companies are using robots, and then with that, the goal is to maintain the productivity. And also, if you probably have watched some videos in China, the drones, little tiny drones, I would delivering things, and it's very effective. And they also built like machines to fight wars, like the in Chinese it's called 机器狼 or 机器狗. Basically means robot dogs and robot wolves. So use those to fight wars. So that's the interesting perspective or movement in that case.
Thanks very much. I'll go to another one here that's an anonymous attendee again, who says, how can the US stay on top of the leaderboard in being a great power? Howard, do you want to philosophize on that?
No, I mean, it should get rid of its present government to begin with, but that's unless you think that the protectionism is going to work as a strong economic policy. It could do. Some British Tories tried it strongly in the early part of the 20th century, Chamberlain and co, and that was seen as the heir to the Disraelian tradition of not selling out to Manchester economics, so to speak. But I don't suppose that would function in the present context. But you've got to have government that people respect it as well as fearing, and people don't seem to respect Trump anywhere else outside of America. That's my impression, apart from Boris Johnson and one or two other people, and of course Viktor Orban. But I'm not the person to ask about this.
No, Daniel.
I mean, so the United States has, if you were to ask, throughout the last 10, 15 years, as we watched the rise of China and in general, the diffusion of power using these indicators globally, right? So, I mean, in a sense, we need to be careful because power is less concentrated by most measures or capabilities than it was 40 years ago, right? So there's been a general diffusion of kind of the raw material of capabilities away from the United States, away from the kind of Western Europe, US bloc, if you will, for quite some time. But if you wanted to say what were the big advantages the United States had that it could leverage to remain dominant insofar, whatever that means, you would say, first of all, it had an extensive, extremely institutionalized network of alliances in which it leveraged the security dependency of some of the world's richest countries in order to influence, get what it wanted to, right? So we're talking primarily about, we might think about primarily the core as being NATO, the Japan-US bilateral mutual defense pact, the relationship with South Korea, Australia, et cetera. But this unparalleled, unmatched still network of alliances, highly institutionalized, highly routinized. You would also say that the United States, although it was fraying, had an incredibly robust, world-leading higher education system that was the epicenter of its basic research complex and had been since the Sputnik moment, since the United States freaked out when the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite and made massive investments and made universities the centerpieces of its R&D. Right. And you would also say that it had this demographic advantage. Because it had reverse brain drain, it still was extremely attractive to immigrants everywhere from the highly educated immigrants all the way to people just trying to get lower wage jobs and work their way up the economic ladder, that it had a higher birth rate than most of its potential competitors, and it had the capacity to continue maintaining this kind of innovation edge. The Chinese, it also had a whole bunch of legacy institutions, a lot like the British had the hangover for their empire for a very long time, extremely capable, extensive diplomatic service with combined centuries of experience under its belt, et cetera, et cetera. The United States has moved to demolish most of those advantages. And it's also moved in ways, as one of my colleagues would say, to weaponize a lot of the infrastructure of that system, particularly on the financial side, in ways that maybe that have undermined that. So the use of sanctions, for example, the overuse of sanctions, which every time you do that makes countries think long and hard about how much they want to be in a situation where they're vulnerable to U.S. financial pressure. And I would say that the United States has been doing, particularly in the last year, sort of even beyond what I expected, and I've written about this, what I would call geopolitical suicide. It is just trashing all those advantages. It's shocking. The Chinese have invested huge amounts of money in trying to build a comparable higher education system. The Chinese have invested huge amounts of money in trying to build a diplomatic corps with those capabilities, and we're just destroying it because of a combination of kind of anti-bureaucracy ideology, some of which has some basis, but I think most of which doesn't, and then a desire to personalize rule right now, to bring the government under the heel of to destroy the quote unquote deep state, but really destroy the kind of the system, that made all of this possible. So it's just shocking. And I don't actually think we can recover from it that easily. I think some of this damage is a generational work to undo. I think it's comparable, I'm sorry, David, but I think it's comparable with Britain had two world-class industries left over from its empire. One of them was higher education. The other one was finance. And most of its policy decisions over the last 2 decades, even starting with labor, have been seemingly designed to erode those advantages. So, countries do these things sometimes, and, we'll see, right? I don't know how the US reestablishes its credibility and reliability as a partner for a lot of countries. It's not that they're going to leave the system or they're going to exit, but it's that they have to start thinking about things like having an independent autonomous security policy, not being dependent on the United States. And as that dependency reduces, it also reduces US leverage.
Okay, I'm not going to go back to David to answer that because it moves us off into other areas. But Marcus Tan had another question that is sent in, and it says, my current impression is that informal institutions like international law and norms and formal institutions like the United Nations are declining in importance and influence. The conversation has only lightly touched on these topics, which might be indicative of this trend. How do you anticipate these institutions evolving over time and interacting with current and rising great powers? David Jones. You're muted, David.
I know, I'm sorry, I was having difficulty unmuting. Yeah, I think that that's a very fair observation. I do see these international organizations declining in terms of importance. I mean, not least because the US president very recently actually went into the UN in New York City and basically badmouthed it, which I thought was not a particularly wise thing to do. I think we come back to the role of the United States. I mean, what Daniel was just effectively saying, I think, was that the 20th century was the American century, and the 21st century looks as if it won't be. And I personally think that that would be a huge pity. I think that the United States has, over the years, over the last couple of centuries, by and large, been a very strong force for good in the world. It's been an exemplar of a free liberal democracy can operate, and may I say a capitalist democracy too. That's declining, and I think as a consequence of that, the great organizations, the international organizations that regarded the US as a linchpin, are also declining. And when these international fora start to decline in importance, it's actually very dangerous for the world as a whole. So I think, to echo, although not precisely, what Daniel was saying, we do need to see a lot more American engagement in the councils of the world rather than a withdrawal from them.
Nancy, do you agree with that?
I agree with both comments. And I think that I would add one thing. Yeah, in the end, it's all about American leadership. But the leadership in the United States is not, really not doing very well. And somehow our selection of national leaders is not. Somehow we do not get the best and brightest. We have 350 million people, but somehow, the candidates that was selected are not that great. So anyhow, the point here is that I agree with Daniel about the geopolitical suicide. And I also see not only geopolitically, and I see also on the national survival level, it's also it's suicidal. Because when you have a leader who comes in and then basically overthrow anything was already there, and then another leader comes back and then just undo the same thing, and this country cannot move forward. So in the end, I think it's the quality of national leaders.
Thank you for that. I'm going to give the last word to Howard, and then I'm going to have to round up. Howard.
What, on the state of America?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had my first remark thinking that I was not right to say very much, but Daniel seemed to fill out in much more detail what I was in effect saying. And I do think it is a disaster for us all. I agree with David on that. You need American leadership, and you need them to be relying on whatever you want to call it, constitutional government, rule of law, Western values, and you can't rely on that with Trump or with most of the people around him, because they're only interested. Whereas in the 30s, the baddies were ideologues who believed in some nutty things. The baddies in the world now seem to be more like James Bond villains. They're just rich people who want to be very rich people and think that gives them the right to control everything. And I don't know what you do with people like that, apart from blow them up like happens in James Bond movies, but that's quite difficult to do. It does seem to me that's the kind of thing that Trump and the people surrounding him are like. In a sense, Viktor Orban's like that. He's only interested in power. He doesn't care whether he's left or right. As he said to a friend of mine in the early 90s, there's no room on the left now, so we have to move to the right for Fidesz. And a lot of the people who are interested in the power are that kind of person. Putin is in a way, except he's probably a genuine Russian nationalist.
Okay.
I don't have a relevant comment, but it's the way it seems to me to be.
I'm going to have to draw it to a close at that point, unless Daniel, you wanted one very quick statement there.
I think I would actually argue that the U.S. is being governed by a fusion of what we would have once called far right ideologues and kleptocrats and oligarchs. But I actually think that this is really important. I think the Trump administration has dismantled the entirety of the U.S. anti-corruption infrastructure, and to the extent that it uses against political foes, not against corrupt foes. And this is a huge important sea change. And I think that we can talk about great powers all we want, but one of the things that's going to affect a lot of people in the world much more than the relative ranking of the US or China is whether we live in a world where globalized kleptocracy is the dominant form of political economy. And the US has become gone from being a hedge against that to being a promoter of that. And that's really scary.
Can I just make one last brief comment? The alliance between greed and stupidity is the most antichrist kind of thing that you can imagine, almost, and that's what you're attending to get. People who own Fox News and the people who take notice of what it says. That's the and Trump is-
Fine. Thank you very much. Thanks to Howard Robinson, David Jones, Nancy Ray, and Daniel Nexon. I don't know whether Sandy, whether you want to say anything before I absolutely close up.
Yes, just one comment. I think there have been some very astute observations made in the course of this conversation, and in the unlikely event that Donald Trump were to tune into it or see it online afterwards, he would just say it's all fake news, and that's the sad thing. He wouldn't pause and weigh some of these very sophisticated and helpful points of view. But I want to join you, Mike, in thanking everyone. I think this was a wonderful conversation with some eloquent voices. Thank our partner, John McCabe, who makes these things get on the air and happen. And of course, the people at Georgetown who have encouraged and nurtured this program for 61 installments so far. And of course, it's always a pleasure working with you, Mike, and I thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that. The last in the series of free speech projects at the Crossroads International Dialogues will actually take place on Wednesday, December the 10th. We are coming to an end after 5 years, and I think it's very interesting what we've chosen as the talk next time on the 10th of December, because we're going to ask whether universities themselves are losing the battle for free speech. And we have been about free speech for the last 5 years, and we just wonder where it's going to go. Have we been able to make any difference at all? I hope we have. The last Cultural Encounters books that have made a difference will be on November the 17th, when Mike Collins from Georgetown will be looking at America's encounter with the land. I've actually read his talk already, and it is just wonderful. So please tune in for that. Again, it's at 4 p.m. and that's on November the 17th. But again, that will be the last in that series as well. I'd echo my thanks to Sandy's thanks to Tom Banchoff at Blackfriars, to John O'Connor, the Regent, Hugo Slim, the new director of Las Casas Institute, and at the Master of Campion Hall, Dr. Nick Austin. Special thanks from me as well to John McCabe. And I'd like to thank everyone who asked questions. We didn't get through them all at the end, but thank you very much for putting them forward. And thank you for attending today and for all your support of our various series. And my special thanks to Sanford J. Ungar, the director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown. It's a joy working with you, Sandy. Thank you very much. I'm Professor Michael Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, which is a private institutional hall of the University of Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook at Michael Kerr Scott or LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Until next time, take care and keep safe. And again, thank you, all the participants, and thank you, the audience. Thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.